In our last episode, we explored the world of women who couldn't have children, or, if they did, those children didn't survive. There are plenty of reasons for this, from religious and medical to political and social. So let's explore some of those reasons and how they affected some of history's most notable. But in this episode, let's take a look at men. As a man, it sounds like an easy task, right? The role of procreation has always been placed firmly on the shoulders of women throughout history. But what happens when it turns out that the male half of the equation has some issues of his own? Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out what happens when kings can't have kids. It's me, and you're watching. Kings, queens, and the oddest things they did for love. One of the most well-known cases of a king unable to produce children was Henry VIII of England. He has a reputation for being a rotund, violent, and passionate lover. History tells us that he wed 6 times, and while he had several children, only 3 of them survived to adulthood. You may recognize his daughter, Elizabeth I, who was the last Tudor monarch. But what many people don't know is that this famous monarch was actually the 3rd of her name. Before her came Mary, and before her, Henry had actually 2 more children named Henry and a girl named Catherine, both of whom died in infancy. This inability to produce surviving children almost brought down the House of Tudor. As mentioned in our last episode, he went through a number of wives in search of a son. Catherine of Aragon, the woman who was married to Henry for 24 years and bore him Mary, was ultimately sent away because Henry wanted someone who could bear him a male heir. However, this quest led to the creation of the Church of England, as Catherine, who was once the darling of the Spanish monarchy, was very reluctant to leave Henry, who she considered to be her lawful husband. Henry, stubborn as ever, wanted an annulment, and when the Pope wouldn't grant it to him, he took matters into his own hands, breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England, which would make him supreme head of the church. He quickly married Anne Boleyn, and she too failed to bear him a son, although she did give him Elizabeth. After Anne's demise, Henry married Jane Seymour, who finally gave him the son he so desired, King Edward VI. But Jane too died after giving birth. That's when the parade of mistresses and short-term wives began, bearing him children who were legitimized but not necessarily accepted into the royal court. His need for a son led to bloodshed, political upheaval, and religious reform. Henry wasn't alone in this pursuit. Throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa, there have been countless monarchs who could not sire legitimate children and had to take lovers on the side, usually without consequence. But once the stigma of not having a legitimate son caused quite a bit of trouble. In fact, in Russia, there was a period of time where the Tsars were known as the sickly dynasty, because for 170 years, no heir to the throne lived past childhood. Beginning with Peter I, every Tsar was either physically or mentally challenged due to genetic defects that plagued the family tree. For instance, Peter I, who founded St. Petersburg, was incredibly short, had a chronic bladder infection, was epileptic and impotent. His son Alexia was born with hemophilia and died under mysterious circumstances. The next 4 Tsars were all born with dwarfism, and while they could father children, none of those children survived to maturity. The last 2 Tsars of Russia were Peter II and Anna Ivanovna, neither of whom could have children and who were also related to each other, which contributed to the defective genes. Talk about a sad ending to a dynasty. Now, sometimes the problem wasn't with the king, but with the queen, or rather, it was with the queen's womb. There were numerous royal queens throughout history who were simply unable to bear children for whatever reason. Sometimes this was due to medical conditions, such as uterine prolapse, which was fairly common amongst women of the royal families. Uterine prolapse is when the uterus drops out of its normal position, causing a number of complications and making pregnancy nearly impossible. In the days before modern medicine, this was almost always fatal to the mother. Queen Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII and the first Queen of Scotland, had several pregnancies, but lost all of them to potential uterine prolapses. Another factor which could have contributed to these miscarriages was her consanguinity with her husband, James IV of Scotland. Like many royals of the era, James and Margaret were third cousins once removed, and they had several children together, none of whom survived. When James died, Margaret acted as regent to their son, James V, until his death. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, infertility in women was often attributed to witchcraft, a phenomenon which we've discussed before. Infidelity was another popular explanation for the lack of offspring, with rumors swirling around the royal courts that perhaps the king's bride was unfaithful to him. And believe me, many members of the clergy were only too happy to confirm this gossip. Sometimes, however, the blame game got downright weird. Take, for instance, the issue of anal sex. Believe it or not, many European kings over the years were rumored to engage in the activity. The first accusation came against King Edward II of England, who was said to have used his mistress's girdle as a plug during sexual intercourse. And the rumors persisted with accusations flung against Charles II of England, Henry VIII of France, and even Louis XV of France. The idea that anal sex could cause infertility persisted, with some doctors claiming that sperm could enter the body through the rectum and poison it, resulting in pregnancy being impossible. Luckily, science has disproven this theory, but the stigma continued on. Charles II of Sweden was accused of having anal relations with men, which allegedly resulted in rectal prolapse and ulcers. This claim was made by his own valet, who claimed that the king did engage in these activities, but that he himself was innocent. And despite the lurid details, there is no evidence to prove that any Swedish king engaged in anal sex. Another unfortunate reality of medieval life was that diseases ran rampant, and children who were born sick or with birth defects were often killed at birth or shortly thereafter. Fossy, jaw, rickets, and a number of rare disorders were commonplace, as testing for genetic disorders didn't become a thing until the 20th century. It should be noted that in some royal courts, the king's ability to sire children wasn't seen as important. For instance, the infamous Ivan the Terrible of Russia produced no surviving children with his wife. but he did have a son out of wedlock, which didn't disqualify him from taking the throne. Similarly, many African and Asian courts allowed for multiple wives, meaning that if one wife couldn't bear children, then another could. In fact, in some countries, children born outside of wedlock were common and often given noble titles, ensuring that they would receive a quality education and resources. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that while the role of procreation was foisted onto the women in royal families, men also played an important role in the process. Their bodies were just as scrutinized and discussed behind closed doors. If they were unable to do their part, they were subject to ridicule, gossip, and political fallout. Luckily for us today, medical science has come a long way, and the taboo nature of discussing STDs and genetic disorders has disappeared, leaving men free to discuss their problems without fear of public humiliation. Well, maybe not the last part. Thanks for watching, and if you liked this video, please remember to subscribe. Also, we now have a page that you can support us on, which allows you to see videos early, send us messages, and get other cool perks. Check it out by clicking the link in the description below. If you've made it this far, I can only assume you'll either enjoying this series, or you have unslept in days and are considering drifting off permanently. If it's the former, please do send in your suggestions for future episodes. If it's the latter, I feel your pain. Fatherhood is exhausting. Ruling a country is exhausting. Keeping children alive in the 18th century would exhaust anyone. So let's keep moving. And speaking of which, here's our next installment in this series. Hello and welcome back to the series on the secrets of the royal nurseries. For the past 2 episodes, we've talked about how queens were blamed if children weren't forthcoming, how some of them dealt with the pressure, and how the men they were married to were also sometimes the problem. Now it's time to examine the children themselves. What happened to them after they were born? How did they grow up? And how did their upbringings prepare them for life in the royal nursery? Let's start with King James I of England, son of Mary, Queen of Scots and Lord Darnley, whose troubled birth we covered in part 1, done. A Scottish nobleman with an unfortunate tendency to stab people was dead within a year of James's birth, and Mary soon followed him, executed on the orders of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. So James spent his early childhood in the courts of Scotland, then France, then England, shuttled around Europe while powerful relatives fought over his inheritance. In the end, he took the throne of England at the age of 14, and things haven't really gone smoothly since. While he survived childhood, James never really shook his unsettled start. He was suspicious of foreigners, afraid of assassination, and obsessed with witchcraft. Unlike his mother, he never married again. And unlike his grandmother, he had no children. So much for continuing the Stuart dynasty. But hey, maybe it was all those strolls around Europe that got him interested in witches, right? Moving forward several centuries, we meet Gustavus Adolphus, the great warrior king of Sweden, hero of the 30 Years' War, and winner of the Battle of Lutzen. He was killed in action at age 37, but not before marrying and producing 8 children. Unfortunately, all 8 were girls. So when Gustavus died, the throne passed to his brother, who promptly killed all of his brother's daughters, fearing they might make claims to the throne. You heard me right. He killed them all, probably because he knew how much of a badass his brother's daughters were. One of them, Christina, was a brilliant student and later became the Queen of Sweden, while another, Maria, became the Duchess of Finland, and yet another, Hedwig, was the Queen of Poland. But their uncle didn't know any of that. He just saw 8 potential rivals and eliminated them. As for the dynasty, well, Gustavus had 9 grandchildren, but none of them inherited the throne because they weren't the eldest sons of his eldest daughter. That honor belonged to his niece, who went on to become the Queen of Sweden, proving, among other things, that even a great king doesn't get to decide which of his descendants will inherit the crown. Finally, let's meet William, the 3rd child and 2nd son of Queen Anne, Prince George of Denmark. Remember them. Their oldest daughter had died, as had their 2nd child. So William and his younger sister, Mary, were the last hope of continuing the Stuart dynasty. They were raised largely apart from their parents, first by wet nurses and then by governesses, which probably contributed to their mutual shyness. They were educated alongside Mary, Princess of Orange, and their tutor, Samuel Giti, was famous for his progressive ideas about education. As a result, both William and Mary were intelligent, speaking multiple languages and understanding complex political issues. But the siblings also developed a habit of hoarding their toys, which was seen as an unhealthy sign of greed. So, as teenagers, they were shuffled from home to home, living with various relatives, while Anne and George hoped someone else would take care of them. It was only when they were adults that William and Mary returned to court, largely to keep and company as she struggled with ill health. In fact, Mary was so neglected that she never married. But when their half-sister Queen Anne died without children, William and Mary found themselves joint monarchs of England. Fortunately, they were prepared. Their intelligence helped them navigate the complexities of governance, and their shared childhood struggles forged a bond between them that helped them overcome their shyness. Unfortunately, they went on to ruin the country. But more on that in a future episode. See you then.